The crack of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Knights Ferry, California, making Louisa Livingston flinch as she clutched her worn carpet bag tighter to her chest. It wasn't the sound itself that frightened her. She'd grown too accustomed to loud noises that meant danger, but the memories they triggered of hands that never knew gentleness, and a marriage that had become her prison. The year was 1875, and Knights Ferry had seemed far enough away from San Francisco, far enough from him. 3 days on a bumpy stagecoach had left her body aching, the bruises beneath her high-necked dress still tender to the touch. She'd been grateful for the modest fashion of the day that concealed the marks of Gerald's farewell beating, though the pain stabbed through her ribs with each breath. "Madam, you planning on standing in the middle of the street all day?" The stagecoach driver's gruff voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Station's just yonder." "Thank you," she murmured, tucking a loose strand of honey-brown hair behind her ear. At 26, Louisa should have had the bloom of youth still upon her, but 5 years with Gerald had etched lines around her eyes that spoke of too many tears and not enough laughter. Knights Ferry wasn't much a main street lined with wooden buildings, a few side streets with modest homes, and the imposing water-powered flour mill that had put the town on the map. It was nothing like San Francisco's bustling streets, but that was precisely why she'd chosen it. She needed anonymity, a place to disappear. The whiskey-soaked laughter from the saloon made her step quicken. Men's voices, loud and boisterous, always set her teeth on edge now. Her gaze swept nervously around the street, wondering if Gerald had somehow tracked her here already. The local sheriff's office provided little comfort. Gerald had friends in law enforcement back in San Francisco, men who looked the other way when a husband disciplined his wife. The station house, a modest building with peeling white paint, stood at the edge of town. The sign hanging crooked on the front promised rooms for rent, and Louisa only hoped she had enough money to secure one. The small pouch of coins sewn into the hem of her dress represented every penny she'd managed to squirrel away over years of marriage. The doorbell jingled as she entered, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, miss?" she asked, pushing wire-rimmed spectacles higher on her nose. "I need a room, please, just for a few nights until I can find more permanent lodging." Louisa kept her voice steady, determined not to show weakness. The woman studied her, eyes lingering a moment too long on the fading bruise at Louisa's jawline that her high collar couldn't quite hide. Something in the woman's expression softened. "I'm Martha Wilson. My husband and I run this place." She turned the guest book toward Louisa. $2 a night includes breakfast." Louisa nodded, relieved. She could afford that for now. Her fingers trembled slightly as she signed the book with her maiden name. "Do you know of any work in town?" "I'm skilled with a needle and can keep accounts." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "You educated then?" "My father was a schoolteacher before he passed." Louisa didn't mention that Gerald had forbidden her from using those skills once they wed, claiming no wife of his would work like a common woman. "Well, as it happens, Mrs. Carmichael at the general store was saying just yesterday she needs help with the books and the sewing orders." Martha pulled a key from beneath the counter. "Room 4, up the stairs and to your right. There's a pump out back for washing." "Thank you." Louisa reached for the key, wincing involuntarily as the movement stretched her tender ribs. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. "You in some kind of trouble, miss?" Louisa stiffened. "No, madam, just tired from the journey." Martha didn't look convinced but nodded anyway. "Supper's at 6 if you're hungry." Louisa climbed the narrow staircase, each step sending fresh waves of pain through her body. The room was small but clean. A narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a small window overlooking the street below. It wasn't much, but it was hers, at least temporarily. She set her bag on the bed and finally allowed herself to sink down beside it, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. She'd done it. She'd escaped. But the fear still coiled inside her like a snake, ready to strike at any moment. She knew better than most that running wasn't enough. Gerald wouldn't give up what he considered his property so easily. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, hollow-cheeked, with shadows beneath her eyes and that yellowing bruise at her jawline. Her fingers traced it gently, remembering the blow that had put it there. It had been the final straw, delivered when she'd accidentally burned his breakfast 3 days ago. She'd waited until he left for his shipping office, packed what little she could carry, and fled with the money she'd been hiding. Louisa unpinned her hair, letting the light brown waves fall past her shoulders. She would rest, just for a moment, before going to inquire about the position at the general store. She needed to establish herself quickly, build a new life before Gerald could destroy this one too. She didn't realize how exhausted she was until she woke to knocking at her door. Startled, she sat up quickly, gasping at the pain in her side. "Miss Livingston, supper's ready if you're wanting some," Martha called through the door. Louisa smoothed her rumpled dress and pinned her hair hastily. "Coming, thank you." The dining room downstairs had 3 tables, but only one was occupied. An elderly couple sat near the window, and a man in dusty trail clothes ate alone at another. Martha gestured Louisa to an empty chair. "Hope you like beef stew. It's what we've got tonight." The aroma made Louisa's stomach growl embarrassingly loud. She hadn't eaten since a meager breakfast on the stagecoach. "It smells wonderful." Martha set a steaming bowl before her, along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat up. You look like you could use it." Louisa ate slowly, savoring each bite. Gerald had often withheld meals as punishment, and the simple pleasure of eating without fear was something she'd nearly forgotten. The door to the station house opened, letting in a gust of cool evening air and a man whose presence seemed to fill the small dining room. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that would normally make Louisa shrink back, but there was something in his unhurried movements that didn't trigger her usual fear. "Evening, Xavier," Martha greeted him. "Stew's hot." "Much obliged, Martha." His voice was deep but quiet, a low rumble rather than Gerald's sharp bark. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the edges, and Louisa caught a glimpse of startlingly blue eyes before she quickly looked back at her bowl. The man Xavier took a seat at the table farthest from her, his spurs jingling softly as he moved. Louisa kept her head down, focusing on her food, but she could feel his gaze on her briefly before Martha set a bowl in front of him. "Miss Livingston's new in town," Martha said, loud enough for Louisa to hear. "Xavier Zimmerman runs the livery stable and does some ranching outside town, finest horseman in the county." Louisa managed a small nod of acknowledgement without making eye contact. "Welcome to Knights Ferry, miss," Xavier said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Thank you," she replied softly, still not looking up. Dinner continued in relative silence. Louisa finished quickly, wanting to retreat to the safety of her room. As she stood, however, a sharp pain lanced through her ribs, making her gasp and clutch the edge of the table. "You all right, miss?" Xavier's chair scraped back as he half rose. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the words coming out too fast. "Just stiff from the journey." She could feel his eyes on her, assessing, but he didn't press the issue. She thanked Martha for the meal and hurried back upstairs, locking the door behind her. Morning came with the sound of wagons and horses on the street below. Louisa dressed carefully, choosing her highest-necked dress to hide the worst of the bruises. The general store was easy to find, a two-story building in the center of town with Carmichael's Goods and Sundries painted across its storefront. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. A plump woman with kind eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Good morning," Louisa said, clasping her hands to hide their trembling. "Mrs. Wilson at the station house mentioned you might be looking for help with bookkeeping and sewing." Mrs. Carmichael's face lit up. "Indeed I am. My eyes aren't what they used to be for the fine stitching, and the numbers give me headaches. You have experience?" "Yes, madam." Louisa stood a little straighter. "I kept my father's household accounts, and I've been sewing since I was a girl." The questioning was brief but thorough. By midday, Louisa had a position that would pay her enough to rent a small room above the store once it became available in 2 weeks. The work would start immediately, and she felt a flicker of hope for the first time in years. The bell chimed again as Louisa was organizing the ledgers, and she looked up to see Xavier Zimmerman entering. He nodded to her briefly before turning to Mrs. Carmichael. "Got those nails and horseshoes you ordered, Irene," he said, placing a small crate on the counter. "Need anything else while I'm in town?" "Not today, Xavier. How's that new stallion working out?" They chatted easily while Louisa tried to focus on the numbers before her. She was acutely aware of his presence, of how he filled the small store with his quiet confidence. Unlike Gerald, who commanded attention through fear, this man seemed to draw it naturally. When Mrs. Carmichael introduced her as the new shop assistant, Xavier touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "We met briefly at Martha's last night. Good to see you found work so quick." His eyes, blue as a summer sky, she now noticed met hers directly, and she managed a small smile before dropping her gaze back to the ledger. "Thank you," she murmured. He lingered a moment longer than necessary, and Louisa felt his gaze on her face, likely taking in the fading bruise she tried to conceal with powder. But he said nothing, just nodded and left the store with unhurried steps. The days fell into a pattern. Louisa worked at the store from morning until late afternoon, then returned to her room at the station house. She took her meals downstairs with Martha and the occasional guests, sometimes including Xavier, who seemed to take supper there several times a week. She learned he lived alone at his ranch outside town, coming in regularly for supplies and to tend to his livery business. She found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice. There was a gentleness in how he handled everything, from the way he carefully examined Mrs. Carmichael's goods before accepting delivery to how he spoke softly to the horses when he rode into town. His hands were large and calloused from work, but they never moved with the quick, threatening gestures Gerald's had. A week into her stay in Knights Ferry, the nightmare came again. Louisa woke gasping, convinced Gerald's hands were around her throat. The dream had been so vivid, him finding her, dragging her back to San Francisco, locking her away where she could never escape again. She sat up, trembling, her nightdress soaked with sweat despite the cool night. Unable to face going back to sleep, she lit a small candle and moved to the window. The street below was quiet, moonlight washing over the dusty road. In the distance, she could see the silver ribbon of the Stanislaus River that gave the town its lifeblood. A movement caught her eye, a figure on horseback coming slowly down the main street. Even in the dim light, she recognized Xavier's broad-shouldered silhouette. He was riding slowly, as if in no hurry, his horse's hooves making barely any sound on the packed dirt. He passed directly beneath her window, then paused, looking up as if sensing her watching. Louisa stepped back quickly, but not before their eyes met. She blew out the candle and retreated to her bed, heart pounding inexplicably. It wasn't fear this time, at least, not entirely. There was something else, something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized it, curiosity. The next morning, a small package waited for her at breakfast, a jar of salve with a scrap of paper. For bruised ribs. XZ. Louisa stared at it, then glanced at Martha, who was bustling around the kitchen. "He dropped it off early this morning," Martha explained without Louisa having to ask. "Said his mother used to make it for injuries." "I don't," Louisa began, then stopped. There was no use denying what was apparently obvious to others. "Thank you," she said instead, tucking the jar into her pocket. That evening, after trying the salve and finding it provided surprising relief, Louisa made her way cautiously to the livery stable. She found Xavier brushing down a chestnut mare, his movements slow and methodical. "Mr. Zimmerman." Her voice sounded small in the large space. He turned, not seeming surprised to see her. "Miss Livingston. I wanted to thank you for the salve. It helped." He nodded, continuing his brushing. "Good. My mother swore by it for all manner of hurts." There was an awkward silence, broken only by the soft sounds of the brush against the horse's coat. "I don't mean to pry," he said finally, still not looking at her, "but if you're in some kind of trouble—" "I'm not," she said quickly, then sighed. "Not anymore. I left a difficult situation in San Francisco." Xavier finally set down the brush and turned to face her fully. "A husband," Louisa tensed, then nodded once. "He the one who hurt you?" Another nod, shame burning her cheeks though she knew it wasn't her fault. Xavier's expression hardened momentarily, then softened as he looked at her. "You're safe here, Miss Livingston. Knights Ferry looks after its own." "I've only been here a week," she reminded him. "That's long enough." He picked up the brush again, turning back to the mare. "You need anything else, you let me know." It wasn't much, just a simple offer of help, but it was more kindness than she'd known in years. Louisa left the stable with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the salve easing her ribs. The next day at the general store, she was sorting through a new delivery of fabrics when the door burst open so violently the bell nearly tore from its mounting. Louisa turned, a bolt of calico in her hands, and felt the blood drain from her face. Gerald stood in the doorway, his expensive suit dusty from travel but his face as coldly handsome as ever. His gray eyes found her immediately. "There you are, my dear wife," he said, voice deceptively pleasant. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Mrs. Carmichael emerged from the back room. "Can I help you, sir?" "No need. I've just come to collect my wife." Gerald smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Louisa, gather your things. We're going home." Louisa's hands clutched the fabric so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Gerald's smile tightened. "Don't make a scene, Louisa. You know how I hate scenes." "Is there a problem here?" Mrs. Carmichael asked, looking between them with concern. "No problem at all. My wife has been unwell. I've come to take her home where she can receive proper care." Gerald took a step toward Louisa, who backed away until she hit the shelves behind her. "I'm not going with you," she repeated, louder this time, though her voice shook. "We're finished, Gerald." His expression darkened. "We're finished when I say we're finished. Now come here before you embarrass us both further." Mrs. Carmichael moved between them. "Sir, I think you should leave." Gerald's hand shot out, shoving the older woman aside with enough force to make her stumble. "Stay out of this, you meddling old woman." "Gerald, don't." Louisa cried, dropping the fabric and rushing to Mrs. Carmichael's side. The older woman was unharmed but shaken. "I'm going to get the sheriff," she said, moving toward the door. Gerald grabbed Louisa's arm in a bruising grip. "We're leaving. Now." The door opened again, and Xavier stepped in, filling the frame with his broad shoulders. His blue eyes took in the scene in an instant, narrowing as they focused on Gerald's hand gripping Louisa's arm. "Let her go," he said quietly. Gerald looked Xavier up and down with contempt. This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. This is between me and my wife. Xavier stepped further into the store. I said let her go. Or what? Gerald sneered. You'll challenge me to a duel. This isn't one of your dime novels, you ignorant hick. Louisa had never seen Xavier's face harden that way before, jaw clenched and eyes cold as winter sky. He moved with surprising speed for such a large man, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. Last chance, Xavier said, voice still quiet but with an edge that made even Gerald hesitate. Gerald released Louisa's arm but immediately drew back his other hand to strike her. Before the blow could fall, Xavier caught his wrist in mid-air, stopping it with seemingly no effort. That's not how we treat women around here, Xavier said, tightening his grip until Gerald winced. Take your hands off me, Gerald snarled. Do you know who I am? I could buy this entire worthless town. Don't much care who you are, Xavier replied. All I care about is that you came into this store and put hands on 2 ladies who didn't invite your touch. Gerald's other hand went to his coat, and Louisa gasped as she saw him drawing a small pistol. I'll teach you to interfere in my affairs. Xavier moved even faster this time, twisting Gerald's gun hand until the weapon clattered to the floor. In one smooth motion, he spun Gerald around and pinned his arms behind his back. Mrs. Carmichael, would you mind fetching Sheriff Miller? Xavier asked calmly, as if he were discussing the weather rather than restraining a furious man. Right away, she said, hurrying out the door. Gerald struggled against Xavier's hold. This is assault. I'll have you arrested. Louisa, tell this animal to release me immediately. Louisa stood frozen, hardly believing what she was seeing. For 5 years, Gerald had seemed all-powerful, a man whose anger was law in their home. Now he looked almost small, his fine clothes rumpled as he struggled ineffectually against Xavier's firm grip. You all right, Miss Louisa? Xavier asked, his concerned eyes finding hers even as he maintained his hold on Gerald. The use of her first name startled her as much as his question. Yes, she said, finding her voice. Yes, I'm all right. Sheriff Miller arrived quickly, a weathered man with a thick mustache and observant eyes. He took in the scene, noted the pistol on the floor, and listened carefully as Louisa haltingly explained who Gerald was and why she'd fled San Francisco. He threatened Miss Livingston and pushed Mrs. Carmichael, Xavier added, finally releasing Gerald into the sheriff's custody. Gerald straightened his jacket, glaring at everyone. This is absurd. I came to retrieve my wife, who left our home without my permission. If anyone should be arrested, it's this cowboy for assaulting me. Sheriff Miller looked unimpressed. Mr. Livingston, we don't take kindly to men who come into our town threatening women and brandishing weapons. You'll be spending at least tonight in my jail while I sort this out. You can't do this, Gerald protested as the sheriff led him away. Do you know who my associates are in San Francisco? I'll have your badge for this. The sheriff just kept walking, unmoved by the threats. When they were gone, the store fell silent. Mrs. Carmichael patted Louisa's shoulder gently. Why don't you take the rest of the day, dear? That was quite an ordeal. Louisa nodded numbly, but as she moved to collect her things, she swayed on her feet. The shock and fear she'd been holding at bay suddenly crashed over her. Xavier was at her side instantly, his hands steadying her by the elbows, firm enough to support her weight but gentle enough that she felt no fear at his touch. Easy now, he murmured. Let's get you sitting down. He helped her to a chair, then crouched before her, his face level with hers. Take deep breaths. You're safe now. He found me, she whispered, the reality of it sinking in. How did he find me so quickly? Doesn't matter. He can't hurt you anymore. You don't know Gerald, Louisa said, wrapping her arms around herself. He won't stop. Even if the sheriff holds him, he has friends, money, influence. Xavier's eyes hardened again briefly, then softened as he looked at her. "And you have people who will stand by you now." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I will stand by you, Miss Louisa, if you'll allow it." Something in his words, in the steadiness of his gaze, made Louisa want to believe him. But fear had been her constant companion for too long to be banished so easily. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're brave and hardworking. I know you didn't deserve what happened to you." His hands, resting on his knees as he crouched before her, were large but relaxed, not clenched into fists despite the anger she'd seen in his eyes when confronting Gerald. "And I'd like the chance to know more if you're willing, Mrs." Carmichael cleared her throat from behind the counter. "Xavier, why don't you walk Miss Louisa back to the station house? I think we all need a bit of time to settle after this excitement." The walk through town was quiet, Louisa lost in her thoughts and Xavier seeming content with the silence. At the station house steps, she paused. "Thank you," she said. "For what you did back there, not many men would have interfered in what they'd consider a husband's right." Xavier's expression darkened. "No man has the right to harm another person, especially not someone he's supposed to protect and cherish." The words stirred something in Louisa's chest, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. "My father used to say something similar. I'd forgotten there were men who believed that." "There are more of us than you might think." Xavier touched the brim of his hat. "Rest now. I'll check on things with the sheriff and let you know what happens with him." She nodded, watching him walk away with those unhurried, confident strides. For the first time since seeing Gerald in the store, Louisa took a full breath without pain constricting her chest. That evening, Xavier returned with news. Sheriff Miller had contacted the authorities in San Francisco and discovered that Gerald Livingston was wanted for questioning in some questionable business dealings. He would be held until representatives from the city arrived to escort him back. "What about me?" Louisa asked, twisting her hands in her lap. "If they come for him, they'll expect me to return as well." Xavier shook his head. "Sheriff says that's not how it works. There's no law saying a wife has to live with her husband, especially if he's hurt her. And if you want to file for divorce, Judge Holloway over in Sonora is fair-minded about such things." Divorce. The word hung in the air between them. It had seemed an impossible dream in San Francisco, where Gerald's influence would have prevented any judge from granting it. But here, far from his power base, it might actually be possible. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "The process, the cost." "You wouldn't be alone," Xavier said firmly. "And I know a good lawyer in Sonora who owes me a favor." Louisa studied his face in the lamplight of Martha's dining room. "Why are you helping me like this? What could you possibly gain?" Xavier was silent for a long moment. "My sister," he finally said, his voice lower than usual. "She married a man who seemed kind at first. By the time we realized what was happening behind closed doors, it was too late. She died of a fall down the stairs, according to him." His hands, resting on the table, curled slightly. No one could prove otherwise, and he walked free. "I'm so sorry," Louisa whispered, understanding now the source of his determination to help her. "It was 10 years ago. I was just 18, away working a cattle drive when it happened." He met her eyes. "I couldn't help her then, but I can help you now if you'll let me." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within her. "I would be grateful for your help," she said softly. The weeks that followed marked a gradual transformation in Louisa's life. Gerald was indeed taken back to San Francisco to face charges of fraud and embezzlement serious enough that he would be occupied for months, if not years. Xavier's lawyer friend in Sonora took her divorce case for a minimal fee, assuring her that Gerald's criminal charges would make the process simpler. Xavier himself became a constant, steady presence in her life. He never pushed or presumed, respecting her need for space and time to heal. But he was there helping her move into the room above the general store when it became available, teaching her to ride the gentle mare he kept at his livery. Every resident of Knights Ferry should know how to ride, he insisted, and simply listening when she gradually began to share more about her life before and during her marriage to Gerald. In turn, Louisa learned about Xavier's life, how he'd come to Knights Ferry 10 years ago after his sister's death, determined to build something of his own away from the memories that haunted him in Texas. He'd started with nothing but his horse and the skills his father had taught him, working odd jobs until he could afford to buy the run-down livery stable. Now he had a modest ranch outside town and a reputation as the finest horseman in the county. "Would you like to see it?" he asked one sunny afternoon in late September, nearly 3 months after her arrival in Knights Ferry. "The ranch, I mean. It's nothing fancy, but there's good grazing land and a view of the river that's worth the ride." Louisa, who had grown more comfortable on horseback, thanks to his patient teaching, agreed. The ride took them through rolling hills dotted with oak trees, their leaves just beginning to turn with the approach of autumn. The ranch itself was indeed modest, a small but well-built house, a barn, corrals for the horses, and a bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands Xavier employed. "It's beautiful," Louisa said sincerely as they dismounted near the house. And it was peaceful in a way San Francisco had never been, with the Stanislaus River gleaming in the distance and cattle grazing contentedly in the meadows. "Built most of it myself," Xavier said, a hint of pride in his voice as he helped her down from the mare. His hands at her waist were gentle, setting her on her feet with care before releasing her. "Come see inside if you'd like." The house was simple but comfortable, with sturdy furniture he'd crafted himself and bright quilts that added warmth to the rooms. "My mother taught me to appreciate a well-made home," he explained as he showed her around. "Said just because a man lives alone doesn't mean he should live like an animal." In the kitchen, he brewed coffee and set out biscuits Martha had sent along. They sat at his table, the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, and talked about nothing and everything. Louisa couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease in a man's presence. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Xavier walked her out onto the porch. "I should get you back to town before it gets dark," he said, though he made no move toward the horses. Louisa nodded but lingered, watching the sunset painting the hills with gold and crimson. "Thank you for today," she said. "For everything, really. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there when Gerald came." Xavier leaned against the porch rail, those blue eyes studying her face. "You're stronger than you know, Louisa. You would have found a way." She smiled at his faith in her. "Perhaps. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She hesitated, then added, "The divorce hearing is next week. My lawyer seems confident." "That's good news," he said. "You'll be free to build whatever life you want. I'm starting to believe that's possible." Louisa took a deep breath. "I never thought I'd say this after Gerald, but being here in Knights Ferry, meeting people like you and Martha and Mrs. Carmichael, it's helped me remember there's goodness in the world." Xavier's smile was soft, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "There's a lot of goodness in you, Louisa. More than most, considering what you've endured." Something in his tone made her heart quicken. They stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the slight stubble along his jaw. She had the sudden, startling thought that if he were to kiss her, she wouldn't pull away. But Xavier merely offered his hand to help her down the porch steps. "We should head back," he said, his voice a touch rougher than before. The ride back to Knights Ferry was quiet, but comfortably so. As they approached the edge of town, Xavier cleared his throat. "Would you allow me to escort you to the harvest dance next Saturday? After your hearing, I mean." Louisa looked at him in surprise. The annual harvest dance was the biggest social event in Knights Ferry's calendar, according to Mrs. Carmichael. "Are you asking to court me, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked, finding unexpected boldness in her voice. Xavier's smile was warm. "I believe I am, Miss Livingston, if you're amenable." She considered his request, searching herself for fear or hesitation and finding none. "I would like that very much," she said finally. The divorce hearing in Sonora went more smoothly than Louisa had dared hope. Gerald, still in custody in San Francisco, sent no representative to contest it. The judge, a stern man with kind eyes, listened to her testimony about the abuse she'd suffered, nodded gravely, and granted her petition without hesitation. "You are no longer Mrs. Gerald Livingston," the lawyer told her afterward. "You're free to use your maiden name again or keep Livingston if you prefer." Livingston, she decided. She'd earned that name through suffering. Now she would reclaim it as her own, separate from him. The night of the harvest dance arrived clear and cool. Martha helped Louisa prepare, lending her a blue dress that complemented her eyes and styling her honey-brown hair in a more elaborate arrangement than her usual simple bun. "You look lovely, dear," Martha said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Like a new woman." Louisa studied her reflection in the mirror. The bruises had long since faded, and the constant fear that had shadowed her eyes had diminished. She stood straighter now, no longer hunching to make herself smaller. "I feel like one," she admitted. Xavier arrived precisely on time, dressed in his best clothes, still simple by San Francisco standards, but clean and well-fitted. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "You look beautiful, Louisa," he said, offering his arm. The town hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty, lanterns casting a warm glow over the proceedings. It seemed everyone in Knights Ferry had turned out for the celebration. Mrs. Carmichael waved from where she sat with her husband, and Sheriff Miller nodded respectfully as they passed. "People are watching us," Louisa whispered, not used to being the center of attention. "Of course they are," Xavier replied. "We're the finest-looking couple here." His easy confidence made her laugh, a sound she was rediscovering after years of silence in Gerald's house. The music started, and Xavier led her to the dance floor. "I should warn you, I'm not the most graceful dancer," he said as his hand settled respectfully at her waist. "That makes two of us," she admitted. "Gerald never allowed me to attend dances." Xavier's expression darkened briefly at the mention of her ex-husband, but he quickly smiled again. "Then we'll learn together." They did step on each other's toes more than once, but they also laughed about it. And Louisa found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of moving to music in the arms of a man she trusted. When the dance ended, Xavier fetched her a cup of punch, and they stood watching the other couples for a while. "Would you like some air?" he asked after several dances. "It's getting warm in here." The night air was crisp and refreshing after the heat of the crowded hall. They walked slowly along Knights Ferry's main street, now quiet except for the distant sounds of music and laughter from the dance. "Are you happy here, Louisa?" Xavier asked suddenly. "In Knights Ferry, I mean." She considered the question carefully. "Yes, I believe I am. Or at least, I'm learning to be happy again. It feels like waking up after a long, dark dream." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You deserve happiness, after everything you've been through." They had stopped walking, standing now in a pool of moonlight outside the shuttered general store. Louisa turned to face him fully. "So do you, Xavier. After losing your sister the way you did, You could have become bitter or vengeful. Instead, you built a life of kindness." He looked surprised at her assessment. "I don't know about that. I just try to live by what my father taught me, to respect others and work hard." "It's more than that," Louisa insisted. "You showed me what gentle hands feel like when I'd forgotten such a thing existed." Xavier's expression softened, and he slowly, carefully, raised one hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. His touch was feather-light, giving her every opportunity to step away. But Louisa didn't move, her eyes holding his. "May I kiss you, Louisa?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she breathed. His lips met hers with a gentleness that made her heart ache. It was nothing like Gerald's demanding kisses. This was an offering, not a taking. When they parted, Louisa found herself leaning toward him, not away. "I've wanted to do that for quite some time," Xavier admitted, his hand still cradling her cheek. "I'm glad you waited," she said honestly. "I needed to feel safe first. I'd wait however long you needed." His thumb stroked her cheek once before he lowered his hand. "We should probably get back before they send out a search party." The remainder of the evening passed in a happy blur. Louisa danced not only with Xavier but with Sheriff Miller and Mr. Carmichael as well, feeling truly part of the community for the first time. When Xavier walked her back to her room above the store, she felt a contentment she hadn't known in years. "Good night, Louisa," he said, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "May I call on you tomorrow?" "I'd like that," she replied, watching him walk away before closing her door with a smile. Their courtship progressed steadily through the winter months. Xavier was patient and respectful, never pushing for more than Louisa was ready to give. They went on picnics by the river when weather permitted, shared meals at Martha's, and spent long evenings talking by the fire in Mrs. Carmichael's sitting room. Louisa learned to trust again not just Xavier, but herself as well. She rediscovered her own strengths, taking on more responsibilities at the general store, and even teaching reading to several of the town's children whose families couldn't afford to send them to the school in Sonora. In early spring, Xavier took her on a ride to a beautiful overlook on his property, where wildflowers had begun to carpet the hills. "I have something to ask you," he said as they stood looking out over the valley, the river winding like a silver thread below. Louisa's heart quickened. "Yes." Xavier took both her hands in his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I love you, Louisa Livingston. I think I have since that first night at Martha's, when you sat so quiet and brave despite your pain." Tears sprang to her eyes at his words. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easily now that she knew what real love felt like. Xavier smiled, but his expression remained earnest. "I want to marry you if you'll have me, but I need you to know that I understand if you're hesitant about marriage after what you've been through. We could continue as we are if that's what you prefer." Louisa squeezed his hands. "I was afraid of marriage once," she admitted, "but that was because I didn't understand what it should be. You've shown me that it can be a partnership built on respect and kindness." She took a deep breath. "Yes, Xavier Zimmerman, I will marry you." The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the hills. He lifted her hands to his lips, kissing each one reverently. "I promise to cherish you always," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To listen to your thoughts and respect your wishes, to never raise a hand to you in anger." "I know," Louisa said softly. "I trust you." Those 3 words seemed to mean as much to him as her acceptance of his proposal. Xavier drew her gently into his arms, kissing her with such tenderness that she felt tears threatening again. They married in late April, with the whole town turning out to celebrate. Martha cried openly during the ceremony, and even Sheriff Miller looked suspiciously misty-eyed. Mrs. Carmichael had helped Louisa sew her wedding dress simple but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons down the back that Xavier would later undo with reverent hands. Their wedding night was nothing like her first with Gerald. Xavier was patient and gentle, asking permission at each step, his hands bringing pleasure rather than pain. When Louisa cried afterward, they were tears of relief and joy, not the silent suffering she'd endured in her first marriage. "I didn't know it could be like this," she whispered as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom at Xavier's ranch, their ranch now. He stroked her hair, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It should always be like this. Two people choosing each other, caring for each other." Life settled into a rhythm of contentment. Louisa continued working at the general store 3 days a week while helping Xavier with the ranch books. They expanded the house, adding rooms for the family they hoped to have, and planted a garden where Louisa grew vegetables and flowers side by side. News came from San Francisco that Gerald had been convicted of fraud and would serve several years in prison. Louisa received the information with surprising detachment, realizing that he no longer had any power over her life or happiness. A year after their wedding, Louisa discovered she was expecting their first child. Xavier's joy was boundless, though tempered with concern for her well-being. "Are you happy about this?" he asked as they sat on the porch swing he'd built for her, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Very happy," she assured him. A little nervous but mostly excited, his hand moved in slow, soothing circles. "You're going to be a wonderful mother. And you'll be a wonderful father," she replied, laying her head on his shoulder. Their son was born on a crisp autumn day, with Xavier pacing anxiously outside the bedroom until Martha emerged with the news that mother and child were doing well. When he entered the room, Louisa was sitting up in bed, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said, her face tired but radiant. Xavier approached the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation, sitting carefully beside her and peering at the tiny face nestled against her breast. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. "Would you like to hold him?" The sight of Xavier's large, calloused hands cradling their infant son with infinite care brought fresh tears to Louisa's eyes. This was what family should be built on: love and gentleness, not fear and control. They named him Thomas, after Xavier's father, and he grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle spirit. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah, who had Louisa's honey brown hair and Xavier's determined chin. Life wasn't always easy. There were drought years when the ranch struggled, and the children brought their share of worries and sleepless nights. But through it all, Xavier remained the same steady, gentle presence Louisa had first come to trust in Knights Ferry. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised her with a locket containing miniature portraits of their children. As he fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing the nape where her hair had been pinned up, Louisa was struck by how far she'd come from that terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with bruised ribs and a soul full of fear. "Happy anniversary, my love," Xavier said, pressing a kiss to the spot his fingers had just touched. Louisa turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. There were a few more lines around his eyes now, a touch of silver at his temples, but his gaze still held the same steadfast warmth that had first drawn her to him. 10 years, she marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I arrived in Knights Ferry, and other times it seems like another lifetime. "The best 10 years of my life," he said, drawing her close, "and I look forward to many more." As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Louisa watched their children playing in the yard, Thomas teaching little Sarah how to throw a lasso with a piece of rope Xavier had given him, and felt a profound sense of peace. The bruises had long since faded from her body, and the fear that had once gripped her soul had been replaced by love and confidence. In Xavier's gentle hands, she had found not just safety but joy, not just respect but partnership. Together, they had built something beautiful and enduring, a family founded on kindness, a love that healed rather than hurt. And as Xavier's arm settled around her waist, his touch as gentle now as it had been when she was still flinching from shadows, Louisa knew with absolute certainty that this was what happiness truly meant. Not the absence of pain or struggle, but the presence of love that remained steadfast through both sunshine and storms. "I love you," she said simply, leaning into his embrace. "And I love you," he replied, his voice carrying the promise he had made and kept every day for 10 years to cherish her always, to show her what gentle hands feel like, to love her with the kind of love that builds up rather than tears down. In the gathering twilight, with their children's laughter echoing across the land they had nurtured together, that promise felt as solid and enduring as the hills surrounding their home, a foundation strong enough to last a lifetime. As the years passed, Knights Ferry grew and changed, but the Zimmerman Ranch remained a constant, a place of warmth and welcome, known throughout the county for its fine horses and finer people. Xavier and Louisa raised their children with patience and love, teaching them by example the value of gentle words and kind hands. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who shared his father's affinity for horses and his mother's love of books. Sarah became a spirited girl with a talent for drawing and a determination that sometimes tested her parents' patience, but always made them proud. They added to their family again when Louisa was 35, a surprise late blessing they named James, who arrived with a full head of dark hair and lungs strong enough to be heard clear to the livery stable, according to Xavier. Through it all, Xavier remained the same steady, gentle presence Louisa had first trusted in Knights Ferry. His hands, still strong from ranch work, never lost their gentleness, whether cradling a newborn, soothing a child's scraped knee, or touching his wife's face in the quiet darkness of their bedroom. And Louisa, who had once believed herself broken beyond repair, discovered that healing wasn't something that happened all at once, but a journey that continued throughout life, each day bringing new strength, new joy, new reasons to be grateful for the path that had led her to Knights Ferry and the man who had shown her what love truly meant. Together, they built not just a family but a legacy of kindness, of respect, of love that heals rather than hurts. And on quiet evenings when they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the hills with gold, Louisa would sometimes think of that frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with bruised ribs and a heart full of fear, never imagining the happiness that awaited her in the gentle hands of a cowboy who knew how to love.